Hello, good evening. My name is Jeffrey Bollier, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our guest speaker tonight. You know, this is the first presentation that we've had since COVID-19, so it's really kind of a special evening for us. The Bias Speaker Series is in collaboration with the Bias Foundation and the town of Duck. The Bias Speaker Series offers presentations throughout the year by educators, scientists, community leaders, authors, and among others, on a variety of topics. All events are free and are open to the public. And tonight it looks like we have a nice group. So we are delighted that the Bias Speaker Series has been well received by our community, by Duck. And the presentation for the next Bias Choice, if you want to jot this down, will be April 20th. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Josh Nelson. Josh Nelson is a lead park ranger for a group of interns, volunteers, employees working at the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site on Roanoke Island. His greatest joy is collaborating with team members to collectively achieve results, especially when their passion is fulfilled with their work. This started leading with the Youth Conservation Corps in Arcadia National Park in Maine. That was back in 2006. In the following years, positions at Wind Cave National Park, Zion National Park, Crater Lake National Park, and Manhattan Project National Historic Park diversified his experience for 8 years before he's returned to the Carlsbad Caverns for a permanent position. That was in 2015. He's an adventurer at heart, and the National Park Service has given him opportunities like rappelling into caverns, surveying unexplored cave passages, releasing endangered ferrets on the prairie. We don't have that here, Josh. And sleeping on a snow shelter on the rim of Crater Lake. Now I'm delighted to introduce Josh Nelson.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Is everybody able to hear me okay? Yes. So please, as we go through tonight, if at some moment I'm veering too far away from the microphone, let me know, okay? Give me a gesture, raise your hand or something, because I don't often stay stationary when I talk. But no, it's great to be with everybody. I am Josh. Coming to you via a few different places. And you know, I've arrived in the Outer Banks almost 5 years ago now, 4.5 years ago. And I realized quickly that my hobby at the time, caving, wasn't going to work here. I don't know if I've really found my next hobby, but it's certainly, I've been in the water and around the water a lot more than I ever was in New Mexico, which was the last place I happened to be stationed. But this job has taken me to a lot of different places, to a lot of different unique environments, which has been excellent, a lot of fun. And I've been really enjoying my time here. Fort Raleigh National Historic Site on Roanoke Island is the place that I work. Although at the moment, actually, as I talk to you, I'm currently covering that park and also the operations at Wright Brothers National Memorial. So it's a little different experience. I learn a little bit different history, a little bit about airplanes that I didn't know before. I have to expand beyond the 16th and the 19th centuries. But I live in Kill Devil Hill, so not too far south. And like I said, I've been living there for about 4.5 years. And on my way to work every day, I dropped my kid off, who's only 3 years old. I was talking with this gentleman here, and he asked me if I watched a TV show. And I said, I have a 3-year-old, and no, I don't watch TV shows. But when I drop him off each morning, I drive a street. It's California Street. I don't know if anybody's driven that in Manio. I wonder if anybody has an idea of why it is called California Street. Seems a little interesting. Do you know? You can share. Was it named after the community it was there? And yeah, it really, in a way it was. So California Street is really the heart of an area that was purchased in the late 1860s by a group of 11 black families who had been members of a freedmen's colony on Roanoke Island. And these were 11 families that were the ones that stayed. This community at one point had reached 3,500 people. It lasted 4 years on Roanoke Island. The 11 were the families that probably a lot of them already had roots in this area already, at least some of them did, and we know that. But they wanted to stay here. And the story that I've been shared with is it's basically, at the time, there was a saying that would go through communities, enslaved communities, that if you could get to California, they saw that as a place of hope, a place of freedom. And it didn't matter for a lot of the people that were coming to Roanoke Island in the early 1860s that this was the opposite direction of California. Roanoke Island was their place of freedom and of hope. So that's the story that I really want to spend some time talking about tonight. At the park, we often call this the forgotten colony. And the reason for that, well, let's face it, a little bit of a play on words, because we also are the home of what people often call the lost colony, at least where they started. And so when people visit Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, that's often, if they know anything about the history, they often have heard of that story. This other story, though, is just as powerful. And it's something that we've learned a lot about in the last year in particular, to be honest with you. We've been working on a project to better represent this history and to be able to share this history with everybody, and it's a powerful story. And so I'm hoping to give you the general idea of what happened on Roanoke Island in the 1860s, but then also to be able to sprinkle in some of this information that we have just learned within the last few months, and sometimes within the last few weeks, actually. Some of these first-person narratives that we were not aware of before and are unpublished. So that's a really neat piece of this. I think to give you a better sense of the Roanoke Island and really just this area at the time, I want to try to step back in time, back to the 1860s or even before that, 1850s and earlier. And there's a lot of different standing laws, but laws that would directly impact the community of people that I'm going to be talking about tonight. I have a couple of them that I wanted to share with you. These are laws that were laws of the land, and whether they were enforced or not is a case-by-case basis, but they were on the books and able to be enforced. And this maybe gives you a better sense of the time that we're speaking of. This is from the North Carolina Slaves and Free Persons of Color Act. And Section 29 says, if any slave shall teach or attempt to teach any other slave to read or write, the use of figures excepted, he or she may be carried before any justice of the peace, and on conviction thereof shall be sentenced to receive 39 lashes on his or her bare back. Another one here is 73. The justices of the courts of peace and quarter sessions in each of the counties of this state shall have the power in cases where it may be expedient to bind out the children of free blacks where the parent with whom such children may live does or shall not habitually employ his or her time in some honest, industrious occupation. I want to basically rephrase that for you. What that is saying is that a free family living in the state, if it's deemed by somebody else that the parent isn't occupying their time in an appropriate way, their children could be taken from them. This is the reality of the time that we're speaking about. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is in place at this point, and this is a law that it says if an enslaved person or a freedom seeker escapes and makes their way to a free state, or out of the country, or they're headed towards getting out of the country, if they're caught, they're sent back to where they'd come from. And so that's in place at the time as well. Now, of course, we have the outbreak of the Civil War, and there's a few changes that happen within the first year of the outbreak of the Civil War. Early on, the policy of the Union government is that if an enslaved person or a freedom seeker makes it to the Union Army lines, they are returned back to the Confederacy. But that changes fairly quickly, and it changes in a place that's really just north of here. So this map is probably hard to see for a lot of you. It's zoomed out pretty far, but it shows you eastern North Carolina and a little bit of Virginia. So if you were to follow this up on the right side of it, you get to Chesapeake Bay, and in that vicinity you have Fort Monroe. And Fort Monroe is an area where some of the eventual policies of the Union Army start to be created just by individual commanders. This is a man named Benjamin Butler, and just after he arrives to Fort Monroe to take command, it's days later that a number of freedom seekers make it to the Union Army lines. And he takes a position, had a previous background as a lawyer, where he says, look, these men had been working on Confederate fortifications. And so as I would take a cannon or a wagon of supplies or any other thing from the enemy, the Confederacy, I'm going to take these people as well. And so he comes up with a term, and honestly today it's a crude term. It's contraband of war. It's basically labeling people as a product almost. And it's not something that sounds good, and it wasn't good because it almost devalued the person that it was speaking about. However, here's what it did do, is it provided a means, a mechanism in which the Union Army and eventually, shortly thereafter, the federal government, the Union government, to change its policy where an enslaved, if their freedom seeker makes it to the Union Army, they are no longer sent back again. Why do I bring that up? Because it's important. That sets the foundation for what happens at Roanoke Island. Without that, you wouldn't get the rest of the story. The other piece of it is 1861, when General Ambrose Burnside, and if you aren't familiar with this guy, if you look up a photo, you'll understand why the name sideburns for facial hair comes from this man. Okay? He has epic sideburns. He is in command of a fleet and soldiers. I'm not sure exactly the number, but it was somewhere around 13,000 soldiers. And they arrive off of Hatteras Inlet. It's 1861, it's August. They take over Hatteras. At that point, when they take over Hatteras, it's just a couple of days later that during really stormy conditions, they look out into Pamlico Sound and they see this tiny little boat bobbing across the waves. And a lot of the men that were standing there, they're writing about how they would not have been out in those conditions, but somebody was, and somebody was coming to them, and this person was named Ben. It's the only name we have for him, but we know that he comes with a lot of information. He had come from Roanoke Island. He wasn't enslaved there. But in eastern North Carolina, an enslaved person, they had a lot more flexibility, a lot more freedom in many cases than some other enslaved people elsewhere in Confederate states. This isn't a plantation type system. Okay, a lot of the enslaved people were working as pilots and navigators, and so they would have a lot of freedom, a lot of flexibility. They gained a lot of knowledge this way. And they knew how to navigate the sounds. They also knew the Confederate positions, how many men were there, the morale, the quality of their weapons. Shortly after, another young, formerly enslaved or a freedom seeker makes his way to Hatteras, and his name is Thomas Robinson. He's 16 years old. And he ends up giving General Ambrose Burnside the information that he needs to attack and capture Roanoke Island. It's a little bit interesting that he shares with Burnside the best place in his view for a landing of the Union soldiers just happens to be his old owner's house at Ashby's Harbor. That's where the Union Army lands. and that's where a day later, the battle takes place in that vicinity. And the Union Army captures Roanoke Island. It's a day-long battle. It's fairly lopsided as far as there's 2,500 Confederates. They had not received the ammunition, the weapons, the training, the extra men that they had been requesting from Richmond for a long time. They hadn't shown up. And so these men really were up against too much. Well, thank you. Do I look like I'm that parched? Thank you. The battle is against the 2,500s and about 11,000 Union soldiers have landed on Roanoke Island. And so the Confederates end up surrendering within a day at the north end of the island, basically where Fort Raleigh National Historic Site sits, is right where the surrender takes place. When the surrender happens, there's about 200 enslaved men that have been working on the fortifications on Roanoke Island. And those men are given an option because by this time, Benjamin Butler has already started his idea of how to manage things, the contraband of war idea. And so these men are given an option. They're actually given three choices. They can return back to the areas they had been brought from. So these are places west of here in parts of North Carolina, either small plantations or other homes where they had been kept. They could get a one-way ticket, basically, to a northern state, or they could remain on Roanoke Island, and by doing so, they would effectively have their freedom because they're behind Union Army lines at this point. 173 of them choose to return to the plantations or wherever they had come from, west of here. They're going back for their families. They're going back for their friends, the people that they know, the people that they had been taken away briefly to work on the fortifications. They go back to them. They start spreading the word that if you can make it to Roanoke Island, you can gain your freedom. And as you can imagine, this starts the first influx of people coming to Roanoke. And we've learned in the last year that that's really been three distinct phases of people arriving on Roanoke Island. And the first one resembles what we might think about when we think Underground Railroad. We think about groups of people making their escape, getting to an area where they have their freedom, whether it be out of the country or to a northern state or behind Union Army lines. And that's what's going on in the beginning. There's a schooner that freedom seeker, who was a pilot of that schooner, takes it, steals it, effectively, with 24 others in Columbia. And they make their way down Albemarle Sound. They make it to Roanoke Island. Those 173, we can't confirm that any of them make it back here. At least we can't confirm yet. We don't have the name to trace, but almost without a doubt, many, if not all of them, are making it back here with their families. There's an account from Vincent Collier, who was with the Army and ended up being actually the first person in charge of what later becomes the Freedmen's Colony. And he says that, quote, a party of 15 or 20 of these loyal blacks, men, women, and children arrived in a dinghy in front of the general's headquarters where my tent was located. And by the way, this is the day after, or 2 days after, the Union Army has captured Roanoke, so the word spread quickly. They came from up the Chowan River, and as they were passing, they had been shot at by the rebel masters from the banks of the river, but escaped uninjured. They were a happy party, rejoicing at their escape from slavery and danger, and at the hearty welcome which was at once extended to them by the officers and men of the New England regiments, which chiefly made up the corps under General Burnside's command. It rained hard that night, and shelter being rather scarce on the island, I gave up my tent to the women and children and found quarters for myself with a neighbor. And this is how, like I said, that first phase of people, maybe 1,000, 1,500 people, made it to Roanoke Island. And in the beginning, there was no community set up waiting for them. This was just, they are arriving, and it takes a little while for the Union Army to be like, oh no, we need to do something. There was no plan for these people as they came. There's a personal account that was found in a newspaper clipping from 1949 from the Brooklyn Eagle in New York. And this was a woman who was 92 years old at the time, and she remembers as a very, very small child her and her sister had been taken by their mother, escaping from the area around Elizabeth City. And she remembers that, quote, "The rebels broke a stick over my mother's back when she tried to escape with us at the end of the Civil War, and we children fell across her body weeping, but she managed to get up anyhow. Pulling my sister and me after her through the tall grass, and when we finally reached shelter, I remember she collapsed, and they told us that my mother was dead, but she didn't die. And when the dawn came, broken and beaten though she was, my mother rose up from her bed." And she goes on to talk about how that party actually got captured again and got put on a boat headed back to Elizabeth City. But her mother didn't give up, actually ripped off a piece of her petticoat and was waving it to any boat that happened to pass. And a Union gunboat happened to pass and hove to and actually took them back and brought them to Roanoke Island, where her grandparents were living at the time. And she gives us a very, very brief description of sleeping on the floor of one of the cabins of what is the Freedmen's colony. She doesn't use that word. The community, we cannot stand here today, nobody could stand here today and tell you exactly, precisely the outline of the Freedmen's colony. What this is, and I'll start describing it in a minute, but this is a best guess that we have at this time based off of written accounts that we've taken and then measured out. And so you're looking at the north side of Roanoke Island here. And we can say very confidently, we know that the heart of the community was in the area close to the airport, close to the aquarium on Roanoke Island. That's known. But how far did it extend east? How far did it extend north? Those have been vaguer. And this is what we feel like is the case. These were 4 streets. That's what you're looking at here, those lines that go from the top left side down to the lower right side. Those are the different avenues. And then there were lots of cross streets that we don't have put in on this map just to avoid the confusion of them. Basically, how this community is laid out is the southern portion in the area where the airport sits. That is the Freedmen's colony proper. This is an area that there's 1.5 acre plots laid out. There's homes, cabins that are constructed there by the Freedmen as they arrive. Keep in mind, this is all property that's being confiscated from the landowners that were on Roanoke Island, and many had been for years, and decades, and generations. Some of whom owned slaves, many did not. The northern part of the community, that area is where there was an old Confederate barracks. And it's called Camp Foster. Honestly, you can think of it almost like an Ellis Island, where people that are arriving on Roanoke are being brought there and processed, if you will, first before eventually making their way out, if they're lucky, into the rest of the colony. The conditions there are miserable. They're terrible. In fact, we have an account of one mother who had actually taken her family of, I believe it was 5 kids and her parents, elderly parents, and had taken them out into the forest and made a pine bough shelter because that was actually a better living condition than the barracks, the old barracks at Camp Foster. So there's a really a difference between different parts of this community. Most people, like I said, if they came to the upper section, they would then make their way out to the rest of the community. Within a really short time, there's a real sense of community among these people. I mean, you see the first buildings constructed are a church, a school, and 2 churches, excuse me. Those are the first buildings built by them before they even work on their own houses. And from there, it starts to grow. We know that there's a sawmill eventually brought in here. The original and goal of this is it's going to be a long-term community. This is going to be a permanent place for these people to stay. That doesn't end up happening, but that is the intention originally. And so they think, how are we going to make this a livable place? Like, how are we going to support industries? What industries are even options here? So they try different fishing ones. They try this sawmill. None of them end up working out completely, but at one point the sawmill is producing 3,000 board feet of wood per month. So it was working pretty hard. Another phase of people arriving to the Freedmen's colony on Roanoke is the march of General Wild. And General Wild, I mean, you can think about this, if you're familiar at all with the Civil War, when General Sherman makes his march through the South, and he's destroying a lot of things, he's just basically causing havoc, and that's intentional. You can think of that happening in parts of Virginia and eastern North Carolina, but on a smaller scale, but still pretty impactful to the people who are living here. What he does while he's on that march, and by the way, the brigades that he has are black soldiers, so by this point, you, as a black man, you are able to enlist in the Army. The vast majority of the Freedmen's Colony members who are eligible do enlist. And the population of able-bodied men at one point is 139 out of several thousand people. So most have left at this point. But the General Wild's campaign, as he's going through and burning and basically destroying, he's also taking any enslaved person that he comes across. And whether he forces them into it or not, we're not sure, but the result is that any man ends up joining the Union Army. Some probably wanted to, maybe others didn't, we're not sure. Their families, though, are sent to Roanoke Island and promised that they're going to be provided for, and that is a promise that's made by the government, whether they enlist from Roanoke or they end up, the families are getting sent to Roanoke. And so that really changes the makeup of the Freedmen's Colony significantly, and it now is mostly just families, young children, women, and elderly that are on Roanoke Island. In part, that has to do with the downfall, eventual downfall of the different industries on the island. The third phase of people arriving on Roanoke, it's at the fall of Plymouth, and that is when, I would almost describe them as refugees. There's a huge influx, almost 1,200, 1,300 people come to Roanoke Island because the Confederacy has retaken Plymouth, and many of them were formerly enslaved, but there was also white refugees among them as well. And that's towards the end of the Freedmen's Colony, and it has a large impact on what ends up happening, because there's a lot of people who are not able to provide for themselves in any way. Granted, also the industry is starting to decline at that point anyways. And so you have more and more dependence on the rations that are being provided. While at the same time, though, the war is starting to come to a close, and then it eventually does come to a close, and the authorities, because by this point you've had the Army managing this Freedmen's Colony, and then that got transferred in 1865 to the Freedmen's Bureau, which is actually established to manage these people and lands. But they start to realize that they're not going to be able to stay on Roanoke Island, because originally they thought that the landowners would be willing sellers, and that wasn't the case. These people were wanting their property back. They were not selling. And so you end up having people living on a place that somebody is claiming had owned previously. These people are brought in saying, hey, this is now your little acre and a half, your house, and you can see where this ends up. There's not enough space for everybody here. And so the mechanism to try to at first entice, but then eventually force people away from the island and to leave is to reduce the rations. And so there's a letter by a man who's probably one of the most well-known members of the Freedmen's Colony locally, Richard Etheridge. Maybe some of you are familiar with that name, right? He goes on to serve in the Union Army. He then is the keeper of the Pea Island life-saving crew, and he writes a letter with several others stating the conditions of the colony, stating that 3 to 4 days per week, his family can't eat. So this is what ends up taking place, and it's basically forcing these people to make their way into eastern parts of North Carolina, back to places they had once come from, but now in a position where they are trying to get a job, sometimes from their previous owner. The crops, the skills that they often, not all, but many of them had, it was a skill that was only useful for part of the year. And so you didn't necessarily have employment all year round. And so at the end of the Freedmen's colony, you can really find a diversity of stories. You can find some that are heartbreaking, to be honest with you, where they forced off a property that they thought had been theirs, forced to go back to try to find a place to live. And I mean, you have very, very little to nothing as one of these people. And they end up only getting employment for a short time throughout the year. So some real tough situations. You also have other stories, though. And I think that's one of the messages that if you take anything away, take away this, is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all narrative for the Freedmen's colony while it was going on, but also the ending of it. And you have some stories where people who had gained an education while they were part of the Freedmen's colony went on to very healthy and prosperous lives. I mean, Richard Etheridge, I think, is one of those that we often look to as a symbol of that. There were others, though, as well. A man named London Farabee was 16 years old when he was in the Freedmen's colony. And, you know, I'd have to ask one of our park volunteers who has done a tremendous amount of research for us in the last year. I don't know where she got turned on to this book, but it's a book about his life. And then there's 3 paragraphs about his time on Roanoke Island. And you would have no way of knowing from the cover of the book that he ever was on Roanoke Island, but he was. And he talks about his time here. He talks about what of a brilliant student he was. So much so that he became basically the teacher's pet, apparently. And at one point, he's asked by the teacher, which, by the way, I didn't mention this, but the teachers, many of them were missionaries from the north, so that was a big part of the education component. Not all of it, but some of it. And he was asked by one of the teachers if another student, in his words, a dull student, should be taken to one of the other schools. And London Farabee says yes. The student doesn't like it and tries to stab him. So it's these fascinating, kind of rich stories. He survives. He goes on. He has a very successful life. But these little snippets in time of their experiences on Roanoke Island. We have accounts that have been recently found from the 2 sisters who were missionary teachers, and they briefly stopped at Roanoke Island, and they talk about some of the conditions that they saw, and they really describe the difference between Camp Foster in the north, where it was miserable, but then they also described getting given a room to stay in of one of these cabins the Freedmen were living in, and they said it was carpeted. I mean, probably a throw rug, and had a fireplace in it. So some of the conditions were pretty good. Pretty good. One of the biggest challenges with this story, as Fort Raleigh has been trying to share this story, has been we don't have any images. The only photograph that we're aware of is of Richard Etheridge, not only while he's a P Island Life-Saving Station, but also as a soldier, actually. We have one photo when he was in the U.S. military. To our knowledge, the only other photo of the area is taken on board a ship. It's during the Civil War. It's off the coast of Roanoke. It's in Croatan Sound. It's actually facing Mans Harbor, or where Mans Harbor sits today. If anybody here happens to know of a source for a photo of Roanoke Island in the 1860s, we'd be fascinated to see it, whether it be the town of, well, what is now Manio or the Freedmen's colony. You wonder if there's some, I don't know, engraving or photo tucked away in some attic somewhere that's been passed on through generations that isn't even known about, perhaps. but so far we haven't been able to find it. This here is just a watercolor painting that's more symbolic than anything. This is by Mona Curry, who volunteers at the park. And she's just created a few pieces that, like I said, this isn't a scene that we know took place. We know there were churches built, not right on the water like this, but this is some of the hope and the activities that took place once these people were making their way to Roanoke Island. You know, it's one of the challenges as we start a project. Right now, we're about a third of the way through a project that I really would like to share with you because I'm pretty excited about. I'm pretty excited about it. It's a project to try to better tell this story. Fort Raleigh has been a park since 1941. Now, before that, it was a state park. It was originally a private piece of land that was purchased by a group in the 1890s and protected. It was protected because it was the known location of at least part of the English settlement. Right, Sir Walter Raleigh's voyages in the 1580s. And there's this earthen mound or fort. It's reconstructed now. It sits on top of the site where many will say this is the 16th century fort. Based on artifacts, it seems to be the case. Also based on some things found outside of that, but that's a whole nother story. And that is the focus of the park. From 1941, when Congress creates the enabling legislation, it is to talk about the English settlement. That's all the way until 1990. At that time, the park gets reauthorized. The authorized boundary is expanded, and also the purpose of it, the site significance, is expanded to incorporate the other history that has taken place on Roanoke Island. And in a big way, that's the Freedmen's colony and the Civil War history of Roanoke. Since 1990, there have been different things that have taken place inside the museum. If you go there, you'll see a small area that's talking about the Civil War battle and the Freedmen's colony and a couple of items that we believe were artifacts from the Freedmen's colony that have been discovered. There's a monument outside that commemorates the Freedmen's colony. But overall, my opinion as I came into the park 4.5 years ago was that we can do more. We can do more to share this. This is a powerful story. And there's a lot, some that's known, but a lot that we've learned wasn't known before. A great book, if you're interested, is Patricia Click's Time Full of Trial. It's a good start. It's a great foundation. Nothing in there is inaccurate. It's good info. But what we've learned is that there's so much more if you take the time to look for it. It's all around us. And so this trail, this image that you're looking at here, this is a 1.25 mile path that starts at our visitor center. It goes out to Croatan Sound. It's 2.5 miles if you walk back again. And currently, it's a neat walk through the woods. It's pretty. Gets you to the sound at the end here. There's no signage or anything marking that area. And, when we came up with this idea to let's use this trail as an outdoor exhibit to be able to share this history and started applying for grants last year, we didn't realize that the trail itself actually walked over part of what once was the colony. We thought it was just to the south, so we thought it would be close enough that we could say, hey, just to the south is where these things took place. And then we realized through our research that, no, actually some of it was underneath where you walk. And so the plan now is to develop interpretive signs. We also plan to include life-size silhouettes because, frankly, we don't, like I said, have images for these people. So to just try to recognize the people, the stories that we've learned, the story of Fanny White, who was a mother, came to Roanoke Island with 200 other freedom seekers. Her husband goes off to fight in the war, ends up dying, not from battle, but from illness. And and the 40 years of the rest of her life that she spent fighting to try to get her pension clear. Jimmy, little Jimmy, we only know his first name. We know that he gets to Roanoke Island when he's 6 years old. And he's an orphan. He has no pants when he arrives on Roanoke Island. Sarah Freedman, one of the missionary teachers, basically takes him in And the last we know is that he leaves Roanoke Island as, I believe it's Jimmy Banks is the name that he's been given. We don't know if it's in reference to the banks of the Outer Banks, now that we call Outer Banks. We're not sure. But he goes away with Sarah. And there's others, too, that we've been able to identify and to see at least a little bit about the actual story of what took place. And we want to use this space to be able to highlight that. And so that's, it's been an exciting project. I think it's one of the things that has really invigorated us because, I mean, it's a fascinating history, but it's also a very powerful history when you think about it in terms of the United States of America. I mean, Fort Raleigh, like just a few miles away from where you sit now, you have a site where the first English settlement is constructed. It doesn't last, we all know that, but it's the start of the English trying to live and occupy and take this part of the world. Then you have this story talking about a time where this nation was split in two. And there are many other times in our history that have really impacted and influenced the United States of America as it is today. But I feel like these two rank up there among all the rest as some of the most influential times that influence us to this day now. And it's a fascinating thing that Roanoke Island and this whole area collectively has these two distinct representations of these really pivotal moments in our history. Thank you, appreciate it. Yeah. So if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to try answering those for you.
Hang on.
And we have a microphone in back, so we'll just pass that around as we have questions.
Okay. Into the microphone.
After the war, did these people, a lot of them travel north for work?
It's a great question. Did these people travel north for work? And keeping in mind that we don't have a lot of records showing where individuals went, the belief is that many of them did not. Many of them went into the areas that they were most familiar with. And that would be eastern North Carolina and some parts of Virginia. Yeah. That's for the Freedmen's colony. The previous landowners, they do eventually successfully petition to get their land back. Now, many of them, I mean, their land is completely stripped, but they do come back into those places where they had once lived. I'll let you kind of, do you want to decide or do you want me to decide where we're going next with questions? There was one back there, so yeah, let's do a circle. Sure.
What is your basis for the end date of the colony?
Yeah, so 1867 is the date that we show for that, and it basically is when the vast majority of the people have moved away from the island, when the 11 families are purchasing land and are staying here, and that's how many descendants that trace their lines back to the Freedmen's colony. It's often from those 11 families, and so that's the date that we're using. There was a official record that basically says this is now closed by that time. Yeah.
Who was it over here?
There's.
I read that there were something like 600 homes built.
Say that again?
I read that there were something like 600 homes.
Yeah.
Are any of them left, or any remnants left?
Great question. Are there any of the homes left that were built here? None of the homes survive. This area, let's face it, many of you are local. This is a resourceful area, right? I mean, especially, like, we're a little bit isolated now, but this area was a lot of bit isolated back then. And so anything was repurposed very quickly. There was also a lot of the buildings were sold off when the Union Army left the island. The forts were destroyed that the Union Army had on Roanoke Island. They sold off some of it. So it is interesting that you start to see a lot of bricks used in chimneys around that time in homes. We know the foundation of the sawmill was made out of bricks. So a lot of these resources we think get repurposed if they hadn't been sold off. There is one structure that we're aware of that at the time was a hospital. Now it's a shed that's a section of somebody's home on Roanoke Island. And then, yeah, that's basically what we know as far as structures still standing.
Hi.
Hey.
I'm interested in what the population of Roanoke Island was in 1860, for example, and then and then in 1870, and then, of course, your best estimation during the Freedmen, what was the height of population during the Freedmen colony?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I did know what the population of Roanoke Island was in the start of the Civil War. If somebody knows here, please share. I forget at this moment what that population was. I mean, I can certainly tell you the Freedmen's colony adds 3,500 to the overall population of Roanoke Island. That's a pretty sizable number at that time because it was not a huge community. And it's a real stress on resources, not just the rations that are being provided them, but also the, firewood. Like we have accounts from some of the landowners that effectively had been forced off of their property, and at the end of the Civil War, their property stripped bare of firewood. So yeah, but I can't tell you exactly how many were living here at the start of the war. Good question.
It seems like you're still discovering things about the Freedmen's
Very much so,
colony.
yeah.
And is there any plans to do any sort of excavation in that area?
That's a great question. Are we planning to do any sort of excavation in that area? And at this point, there's no plan in place that, hey, we're going to go out and start an archaeological dig. Part of that, I think, is because many of the areas that were once the Freedmen's colony are now the community. So if you go back to this image, the heart of the Freedmen's colony is over the airport, or where the airport sits now. It's under there. It's under the aquarium. It's really in the central part of the northern half of Roanoke Island. And so the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, we could potentially find some artifacts. Likely we would find some artifacts if we conducted a dig in the northern, that smaller block at the north side of Roanoke Island. That's mostly park property. There's a little bit on the south side of Highway 64, which you can orient yourself by the bridge that's coming off the upper left side there. That's Highway 64. That area is very swampy, so the conditions are not ideal. There has been one fairly limited survey done, or archaeological survey done, in the past. It doesn't mean that it won't happen in the future. I think one of the first steps, though, is get to a point where this is known. This story is known while people come and visit Fort Raleigh. And when you can gain that, you can gain a lot more interest in a story. And I think that's a place to begin.
Do you happen to have any of the last names of the 11 families you referred to? And are there any direct descendants still remaining here today?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, Tillett, Barry, there's several and yes, we know that some at the park are descended from the Freedmen's colony. So, yes, my child care provider descends from the Freedmen's colony. Yeah, this community never went anywhere. The vast majority of people, yes, they left, but the people who had been here, and those 11 families who stayed, very much a part of the community.
Can I show you a picture?
What is it?
Can I show you a picture?
Sure.
Is this a real picture? Or?
Yeah, so he's showing me a photo. It's of a log cabin, and there's a white teacher standing in front of it with a group of black young kids. That is in North Carolina. It is down closer to New Bern, where that schoolhouse existed. So that is an actual photo. It's a photo that the park will sometimes use and say this is what we believe the schoolhouses would have looked like on Roanoke Island, but it's not from Roanoke Island, that image that you're looking at.
Did you have one? Oh, she got, okay. Anyone else? Oh. You raise the hand a little higher. I don't run.
So you showed some interesting trails and a trail and
Yes.
that walks over that area. Are there any trailhead markers? If I were to go over there and want to walk that trail, how would I know where to go and what I would see?
Yeah, great question. How would I know where to go and what I would see if I were to go there now? If you go there now, you will find a trailhead sign. It's a small brown sign. It's not the easiest to find, but it's there in the Elizabethan Gardens parking lot, which is, I mean, it's actually National Park parking lot, but the Gardens is right there, and that's where you use. That's the start of the trail from one side, and there is a brown sign there marking the Freedom Trail, and then give you the distance. The other trailhead sign is at the other side of it, so if you went to the Man's Harbor Bridge, and just before you get on it, turn off to your right, to the north side, there's a parking area there. That is part of the National Historic Site as well, and there's another identical brown sign that says Freedom Trail with the mileage back towards the Visitor Center. If you decide to visit after December, you'll find a much more attractive, at least I hope so, sign that's identifying the trail. And then once you start it, you would find those different exhibits. Currently, you won't find any information along that path as you walk it. It's just a nice walk through the woods. You're welcome.
Was there one of, did you have one, sir?
No.
Oh.
Were there other freedmen colonies in other places in the U.S.?
Yeah, there were a lot of different freedmen's colonies, and there were freedmen's colonies, what you might describe it that way. There was refugee camps. There was a lot of different areas that were areas that these freedom seekers were living and built communities around. So this was not unique in that way. One, I think, difference is that this was intended to be a long-term community, even though that didn't happen. So early on, the plans were different, but there was one in New Bern. There was, several throughout North Carolina, and South Carolina had some. The Union Army was making a lot of inroads from the coast in, and so you found a lot of people congregating along the coast. The Gullah people that stretched from North Carolina through South Carolina into Georgia, the Sea Islands, that's where they were living. And they traced their lines back through communities similar in a lot of ways. So this isn't distinct. This area's piece of that broader history. Yeah.
Jim's got one. Sorry, Jim's got one.
So I've heard of researchers attempting to get into the Great Dismal Swamp to do research related to potential colonies that have been in there. Do you have any insight into that research?
It's a good question. I mean, I am most aware of people going into that area trying to do research related to an earlier colony. Some people believe that members of the Raleigh expeditions end up going west, and so I'm aware of those. I'm not sure if those are the ones you're speaking of.
I've always heard that it was like an escape for enslaved peoples to go there and hide.
Yeah.
Basically not necessarily creating a colony, but sort of if you had any.
Yes, so I'm not aware of any specific person working to research that area, although they're probably out there. Certainly, the Great Dismal Swamp was an area that many people make their way to leading up to and during the Civil War. Yes.
And then the path from the Elizabethan Gardens to the north end of Roanoke Island there, is there going to be historical signage along that?
Yes, yeah, that's part of the project that we're working on now. We don't have anything out there, so like don't go over there tomorrow and expect anything. No. But by next year, yes, we'll have signage and exhibits going throughout that whole trail.
Do you know approximately how many?
10.
10 signs. Okay.
Well, 10 areas where there's information. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Neat.
Yeah.
Very neat.
Just as a follow-up to the Dismal Swamp, it is very true that the Dismal Swamp was a refuge for enslaved people escaping the South. And they actually were able to survive in the Dismal Swamp. And the masters and the slave owners and so forth were reluctant to follow them because of the harsh living conditions in the swamp. But they were able to survive, and in the middle of the swamp, they found land that was workable and usable, and it became a refuge, and it also became a route of passage from the south to the north back in the time. So the Dismal Swamp was harsh, it was rough, but it did offer a haven and a refuge to enslaved people from the south to the north.
Yeah, thank you for that. Absolutely. It is, you look at many of the maps that'll indicate different areas of movement for people out of slaveholding states, and one of the arrows goes right in and stops on the Dismal Swamp area. Yeah, absolutely.
Where is the Dismal Swamps? Very far inland?
Right, so if you, where are the Dismal Swamps? And so basically if you go to Roanoke Island, you go across to the mainland, west for a while. Yeah. If you're driving 64, you're in the Dismal Swamp for quite a while. It also stretches north of here as well, into Virginia. So it's a pretty large area and a little bit wet. Yeah, yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Stick around here for a minute. So on behalf of the Bias Speaker Series and the town of Duck, we would like to present Mr. Nelson with this little token of the appreciation here. In grateful appreciation of your presentation, the Bias Speaker Series, Josh Nelson, March 16th, 2023, Duck, North Carolina.
Great, thank you.
She's going to take your picture. And I think in response to some of those comments about the swamp, isn't Buffalo City's not just a new distillery? So there was a section in the swamp, I believe was referred to as Buffalo City, that was a haven for people that were escaping slavery way back then. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So just as a reminder, on the 20th of next month, there's another speaker series. Please come and pay attention again. It's all good stuff to learn. Additionally, if everybody could take a look in their, on their computers and look at yesterday's OBX Voice, there's an article in there about the Wall That Heals, which is the Vietnam Veterans Traveling Memorial that's going to be set up down in Nags Head in November. And everybody, they're looking for volunteers to work either as docents or people that can maybe have a little bit of skills with their hands and want to help set it up. So you can go, there's a link in that news article that you can go to and sign up if you so choose. Thank you.